And my name is Lovin Hill, in case you don't know. But welcome to our the third station of our speaker series on decolonizing research methodologies. So today, we are super happy to welcome Professor Saran Stewart, who joined us from the University of Connecticut in the US. She's an associate professor of higher education and student affairs and the director of global education at the Neag School of Education, as well as the faculty director for the Global House Living and Learning Community. So welcome, Professor Stewart.
Thank you.
So before I leave the floor to Professor Stewart, I'll just have some small blah blah to welcome you with before we start in the heat of the topic. So before I start, I just want to do a quick land acknowledgement. So my land acknowledgement will be a tiny bit different from the usual land acknowledgement because I am not in Canada. And I am in the Caribbean where half of my ancestors own the land and are still own the land they own, and half of them were brought without their consent through the slave trade. They are living, maybe not thriving, but it's important to acknowledge that both peoples are trying to live in harmony, and they try to do it. It's successful, kind of, but we do what we can. But it's also important to acknowledge that a lot of you are joining us from the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. So this is where the University of Waterloo and campus is located. And some of us are privileged to be living, studying, and working there. So depending on who you are, I encourage you to do some research on the history on the land upon which you are now. So a quick background of the initiative. So if you came back, if you came before, but for the people who first joined us, so this speaker series started as a result of a bit of a discussion we were having between students about context and the integration of our own positionality within our research. So we started questioning our privilege and how those affect our research practices. So we had a small pilot workshop in March, and we thought it would be good to continue this conversation by bringing in people who have been on this journey longer than we are, who have the experience of that journey, and who can share their wisdom so that we ourselves also can create our space within the decolonizing conversation. So before we start, some housekeeping rules. We changed a little bit the format compared to the last two sessions. So just to give a bit more of the interaction so that we can, have a bit more of a conversation. So like the other session, this one will be also recorded. You can put question in the chat or raise your hand so that we can unmute you and you can ask your question directly. There will be a session of a question after the presentation. So we do want to emphasize that even if we want you to have, to have this interaction, it's a respectful and safe space. So it's a zero tolerance as usual. So if we see that there is any issue, you will be kicked out straight away. But we want it to be, meaningful and that we can work through the discomfort. So, be open, but be respectful. So I think I went through everything. I hope so. Yes. I think so. Okay. So without further ado then, I will give the floor to Professor Stewart, and she's going to talk to us about decolonizing qualitative methodologies. Professor Stewart, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. So I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement of our own, because I am in Connecticut and I work and thrive on not borrowed land, stolen land. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land in which the University of Connecticut is a territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scotticoke, Golden Hill Pagosset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Always want to thank them for their strength, resilience in protecting this land, and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example, and for allowing us to work and thrive. Ignore the jumping cat in the background. So as I get started, before I share screen, I've gotten used to really identifying how I present on decolonization, on what perspective I do present on it. So let me go ahead and I can at least pull up the first screen so that you guys can at least see that, and then we can go from there. So hold on one sec. Dun, dun, dun. Here we go. Okay, so I currently work at the University of Connecticut. Prior to that, my academic career was solidified at the University of the West Indies in Kingston, Jamaica. So just to give you guys some context into who I am and the positionality that I'm coming from, is that I want to take you back to 1960, right? So according to the United Nations in 1960, some 750 million people were under colonial rule, which at that time equated to about 1/3 of the global population. So you can imagine that 2/3 of the population were not under colonial rule or were a part of the very colonizers themselves. So fast forward 2021, about to be 2022, which is kind of crazy. 2 million persons still remain under colonial rule, and the majority of which reside in our beloved, the Caribbean and the South Pacific region. So I enter this space as a first-generation post-colonial citizen born to colonized parents who reside still within Jamaica till this day. I was raised, educated, and up until last year in the pandemic, I fruitfully worked within the University of the West Indies in Jamaica itself. I say all of this as decoloniality and decolonization are subject to context, the liminalities of the region, the perspective and the intersections of power and oppression between the global northern countries and the global southern countries in particular. And some would argue that Jamaica, although independent, being a sovereign state, still answers to the head of state, which is Queen Elizabeth II. And if you guys have not been under any forms of rocks in the last 48 hours, you would have seen history in the making in Barbados in particular, where they took hold and became, I believe, the 5th Caribbean country to become an official republic. And that's a huge deal. Even bigger deal was that the first Black female prime minister, period, and it just so happens that she is of Black excellence, did this work and also inducted the first Black president, President Dame. And then those who we more popularly know have the living national hero, the Right Excellency Robin Rihanna Fenty. That is a huge, huge, huge deal. We have 6 heroes and a heroine in Jamaica in particular that are on our monies. And the symbolism has always been in our history in Jamaica that we reify our national heroes, and to be alive to see and witness a living heroine is nothing short of being within history. And I say all of this because Barbados received their independence in 1966. And it has taken 55 years to truly be independent and of the United Kingdom in particular, and Great Britain. And it is reminiscent of the Emancipation Proclamation that happened throughout the Caribbean in the 1830s. In 1833 in Jamaica, 1834, it was actually read out loud, but was written in 1833. And I say all of this because then following that was an era of apprenticeship, which was just another form of enslavement, but wasn't just called slavery. So ironically, even though most of the Caribbean countries back in the 1960s under the movement of decolonization became independent, they have still resided as sovereign states, paying heavy taxes to support the head of state. So really want to think about really how far extending colonization truly has been in our era. So when I talk about colonization, I talk about it from the perspective of a Caribbean national, and more so from a post-colonial citizen, being born and raised and educated. So this type of research that I'm really going to engage with you is looking at elements of how I came to know decolonizing approaches and research methodologies. I received my doctorate in the United States, and I'll talk about disrupting the colonizer's gaze, because all of us are somewhat, I argue that all of us are somewhat complicit to the colonizer's gaze by the very training within colonial entities and spaces that were never intended to be decolonized in the first place. And so as I was doing my dissertation and my literature review in particular, which some of you might be in this space, you know, going through the same angst about, I remember we have to defend our comprehensive examinations, and we have to keep, you know, pushing forward aspects of our literature review to be examined. And I remember my supervisors at the time really stating that my first draft used way too many secondary sources. So used just regular articles, historical books and texts, because my literature review was on 400 years of the social history of education in Jamaica from 1655 to the 2000s. And they were like, this doesn't do it. If you want to be authentic to the frameworks that I was using, which you'll see some of them next, like anti-colonial discursive frameworks, as well as post-colonial theories, etc., you need to go back to the artifacts. You need to go to the sources. That meant I had to get a grant to travel to the UK and home to Jamaica to go into the National Library and sit with the archives. And I remember it was under, those of you who are in the Caribbean or from the Caribbean might know about blue tarpaulin that was actually used within the Institute of Jamaica to cover some of these archives because of the sun and the glare and light and how it could destroy these artifacts. So I was able to travel and go and search, and was able to touch the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a visceral feeling of being a citizen and a descendant and of enslaved persons, and being able to touch this document and be angry all at the same time. In addition to that, I was able to find all these amazing narratives that were purposefully erased and omitted from education throughout the years. And that's what I'm going to read some of, so you can help to really understand how social sciences play into this work, and in particular, human progress in doing this work and self-identity. So I have two different computers working from, so brace. All right. So, and I quote, so this is an excerpt from one of the books that I published recently on decolonizing qualitative approaches for and by the Caribbean. So this is from the House of Common Papers in 1831. It reads, it was 1829. Massa called old Charles to pick the largest bundle of bamboo switches he could find. Reverend Mr. Bridges, rector of St. Anne, commanded old Charles to cut all the flesh of Kitty Hilton, a female quadroon slave. She was then stripped of every article of dress, tied up by the hands, her toes barely touching the ground, and flogged until the back part of her, from the shoulders down to the calves of her legs, was one mass of lacerated flesh. End quote, Jamaica, 1831, page 4. Kitty Hilton escaped and dragged her body to the nearest magistrate at the time, only to be turned away and sent back to her master, Reverend Mr. Bridges. She escaped again, a second time, and found a magistrate that could see her hanging flesh and beaten in eye sockets. Kitty Hilton did not receive justice in the formal sense because the House of Magistrates in 1831 ruled 14-4 that Mr. Bridges should not be prosecuted because he was in his rights as her master. However, her narrative was written in the form of abolitionist letters that objected to the ruling and called for the end to slavery in 1833. 75 years later, after Kitty Hilton dragged her bloody body to the nearest magistrate, another Hilton woman would be born by the name of Ethel Hilton of the parish of Lucy, some 146 kilometers from St. Anne. I came to know her as my great-grandmother, the youngest of 4 children, who at the age of 16 years old, took a boat to the other side of the island and sailed to Kingston to start a new life. She was born between the period of post-emancipation and independence, a period of uncertainty and strict British rule. She raised 5 daughters, one of which would be my grandmother, on her own, and was definitively known as the matriarch of the family. Before my grandmother passed, I had the opportunity to learn about her educational biography and life as a child in colonial Jamaica as a part of a grade school project. From her, I understood the importance of oral history, one that was passed down from her mother to her and then to me. She spoke about her tenacious attitude and fighting resilient spirit, how she helped her mother every day in the restaurant to feed all the customers. The colorful tales of colonial Jamaica between the 1920s to 1950s lined with the influx of Chinese migrants, in which her father was one. Little did I know I was engaging in much more than my grandmother's educational biography, but the initial drafts of what I have now termed Afro-Caribbean feminist autoethnography, a decolonizing qualitative methodology. Essentially, her interview formed a blueprint to document feminist epistemologies within colonial Jamaica. More so, her interview pointed to what Rupert Lewis has called the symptoms of the colonial legacy at the psychological level and the way in which Black social mobility and perpetuated values of servility and self-deprecation within the Black community. Then I was too young to predict my current role in this book project and my emergent identity as a decolonizing researcher. I didn't understand the indelible impact of my great-grandmother's history rearing 5 young girls alone in colonial downtown Kingston. How her towering statue of just 5 feet would command hungry men to wait in line for hours for her delectable corned pork and freshly made crackling cornmeal festivals. As an inquisitive young girl, I have vivid memories of Ma Ethel, that's my mama Ethel, of her picking the rice, that is the process of cleaning white rice. And I saw the reverence that was bestowed upon her by her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren. I compared her prowess as our matriarch to that of Kitty Hilton and reimagined the mirrored similarities of grit, resilience, and sheer Black girl magic within the physical embodiment of these 2 women generations apart. This introduction is born out of those ancestral reimaginings and my need to trace the historical underpinnings of decolonizing research for and by the Caribbean. So as you see in the research, more so, and I was researching for this presentation in particular, is looking at what are the ethical bounds that support and tie both forms of research and decolonizing methodologies for sustainability research. So I really look towards some of the ethical areas within sustainability research and some of the nomenclature that has evolved over the last 20 years at least. And so these are these modern definitions of it. And one in particular in Becker's text in 2012 asks for and calls for a paradigm shift for replacement of the established ideal of the human being as independent and solely autonomous to this real fundamental kind of radical idea of a collective dependent area where folks are dependent on not just each other, but also the future generations and nature as a whole, and thereby are bound to that and ethical bounding as well. And so as I looked further, I really started to look at the history of sustainability research and its transdisciplinary nature, and essentially the arcs or the pillars of that work, the economic, environment, and social, in particular, looking at human identity and how that must be coded as such. And so I think where this research and the research I did with my colleagues throughout the Caribbean will most pertain is going to be the pillar on social progress, human capital, and human identity for the self in terms of how you go about doing this work authentically. And so to take you guys back just a little bit, some of these images you might know to what we now know as modern decolonizing or decolonial research frameworks. And I tend to look throughout the Caribbean and also outside, of course. And so I do believe a lot in citation politics as well. And I can explain some of that in the Q&A section if those are wanting to know. So the three images you see are some of the grounding frames of thinkers that I have used in kind of my family of decolonial researchers. You have the formidable Sylvia Winter, who is of Caribbean descent and in the Caribbean diaspora doing this work. You have the Walter Rodney, who is a prolific transnational scholar and researcher that was assassinated for work of decolonization and Afrocentrism and just Black power overall in the throughout 60s, 70s, and 80s in particular. Then you have Frantz Fanon, who arguably is one of the founding persons within decolonizing research. And this again is from how I read the work that I have been doing, looking from the 1960s with the movement into decolonizing a third of the global population. So, you know, take it into modern times or within the last 40 decades in particular, we look at Linda Tuai Smith's work, Tuck and Yang's work in decolonizing research. Some of my favorite comes from George Dye in anti-colonial discursive framework, really pushing a much more radical lens on what needs to happen. And then with the goal of really getting to emancipatory forms of research. So all of these really inform the decolonizing methodology and the work to be grounded as such. And this is where I land most days, to be quite honest with you, or keep getting recentered back to why I do the work that I do, is to incorporate local languages. Throughout the Caribbean, there are multiple local languages spoken, even though the colonizers' language of English, for example, is the predominant in the Anglophone countries. There is also Francophone, there is the Dutch, there of course are the Spanish-speaking countries of the Caribbean, and then we of course have still colonies today. So we have a real strong melting pot of different dialects, accents that are that co-ops languages. So folks will say, no, you have a dialect, or no, we have a whole language. We have a whole syntax, we have a whole vernacular, we have whole phonologies. So to say that we don't have primary languages in Jamaican Creole, for example, does us more injustice. And recognizing, for example, our indigenous people of the Tainos and the Caribs, that was mostly completely wiped away in the Greater Antilles or the Northern Antilles of the Caribbean. and to not remember their contributions to our languages do us injustice. So for example, with the Tainos, they came up with a number of different terms that we use today. The naming of Jamaica originates from the Tainos. It was originally called Zaimaca with an X. And then when the Spanish came in, it became Haimaca. And then when the British came in, it became Jamaica. The process of barbecue comes from the Tainos, which is compared to barbecuing. We in Jamaica call it jerking, and it's the process of preserving these meats and curing these meats actually for enslaved persons so that they would last longer. And so we have multiple examples like that. Bacalao, or salted fish, right? Codfish would be a process of enslaved persons being able to travel long distances with meats that would not, or fish, for example, that would not go bad. So those are things of indigenous ways of knowing that we speak about to reclaim, because we still practice them today, but they're on the peripheries of what is called real knowledge, right? So the work that I do with some of my colleagues is to demand that they stop being on the peripheries, but start being within the center of knowing. And C, recognize and contribute those who are local scholars to our context and edify that work. And then more importantly, celebrate and value the use of oral and visual knowledge, and kind of resist Western ideologies for the most part. So Caribbean qualitative research, for example, and decolonizing research is nothing new. It's just that it has been under-subscribed to and under-coded. And we don't have, I'll be honest with you, as a former chief editor of one of the oldest journals within education in the region, the most formidable at the #1 institution in the English-speaking Caribbean, which is the University of the West Indies. And it only went online in 2016. I know I was there because I was the chief editor in charge of that project. And I say all of this because we have always had incredible researchers and authors and frameworks that was for us and by us, but co-opted under whiteness and capitalism because we simply could not afford to get them, you know, in Taylor and Francis, Routledge, and some of the other prestigious journals that charge in foreign dollars that we can't afford to subscribe to or have our people gain access to. So you found that most people co-opted our research without giving us proper acknowledgement to do so, or frankly saying erased or ignored our research because it'd be like, oh, it hasn't been done. When truth be told, you needed to have probably taken a flight to the West Indian Library on the Mona campus, and it would have been right there. So we have been doing due diligence, especially since 2016, to really push everything online and make that more accessible so that that type of weaponizing of knowledge cease to exist and continue. So ever since Hyacinth Evans, a formidable educational researcher that came in the era of nation building in the country after independence, had a great article about us always having slave narratives, diaries, journals, travel logs, observations, missionary reports, formal research reports, and ethnographies written for and by Caribbean persons, but often uncited and co-opted completely. And so collectively, we've had about 2 centuries of qualitative research that exists in the Caribbean. And then we have formidable scholars that have cited that have paid rise to this work. It really isn't though until the late 20th century that there was a rise in Afro-Caribbean authors. And I named that because that's the majority of the Anglo-speaking Caribbean. So these are some of the methods and methodologies. There's actually Camille Nakid, who is in New Zealand. Shakisha is in Jamaica, and a couple of others. Actually, we belong to a Caribbean Research Methodology Network. They meet annually. They have a great forum and seminar, and out of it has really come some incredible work. So those of you who are looking to do Caribbean research, Caribbean diasporic research methodologies. There are non-Western Caribbean informed research methodologies out there that you should look to first before applying it to people of those populations. So there's Walter Rodney's Groundings and Reasonings. There's Mashup as Method. There is popular old talk coming out of Trinidad and Tobago, liming methodology. We have Maureen Warner Lewis, who is of Trinidad descent, but was in Mona at the University of West Indies in Kingston for a while. And that's what's important to remark about her work that you may not have read, I'm not sure, is one of the first texts that really denounced European conquerors' contribution to African legacies as being nullified or rejecting. So she completely rejected and disputed, both as a female professor academic, that shouldn't go unsaid in a very post-colonial patriarchal system such as Jamaica, as well as a type of research that she did was to really question, establish European, I want to say scholars, but I refrain from doing that as I've reread their work in modern times and realized that they just weaponize knowledge. So like Anthony Trollope, who as an 18th century English novelist really depicted the emancipated Negro man similar to that of a monkey as being idle and unable to read. And that was actually believed for a number of years in schooling afterwards. So she denounces a number of those works and was prolific in doing that. So as we move forward to now, and the research that we're doing is going into your values, how you know what you're doing when you know what you're doing it, and why you're doing it, who are you? And I thought that that really spoke very well to sustainability research, to be quite honest with you, the dependency of sustainable relations, right? Between human beings and nature, human beings and future human beings, and human beings and economic systems, right? And so as started to create and develop something that was more representative of who we are throughout, especially the Anglophone Caribbean, but not only, those that were in this study were also of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean as well as the Francophone. And we examined the axiology, their onto epistemologies for why and how they do this work. And so some of the captions was the analysis of the self, what it meant for them to be Caribbean researchers, how they have to really explore their indigenous roots, that we have it besides those of enslavement, that we have those Taino roots very strong, or Carib roots if you are more in the South or Eastern Caribbean. And now we have to pay very careful attention to the social location and status and perspectives of who we are and where we're coming from, how we were trained in research in order for us to kind of denounce that kind of colonial gaze, right? And gazing. And really understand Eurocentric ideologies, because those are what we were trained under, but how do we understand them to the point where do we need them? When is their proper use? And how do we use decolonizing research for some communities and not for all? So that's also important. So I'm gonna pause there just for a sec. I'm gonna take you into some of the findings and 3 core principles. Are there any questions so far? Because I've covered kind of the background in the context, and I'm gonna take you now into the methodology. Any questions or comments so far on the first half?
Just to remind people, you can put your question in the chat or raise your hand if you want to jump in, and so we will unmute you. So yeah.
Thank you, Ruth. I just saw your comment. I appreciate it. Awesome. Well, I don't mind continuing and then giving you guys space at the end, and then we can come back to slides, because I really want this to be very intimate, very informational, but something that you benefit from, so we can really have dialogical discourse, okay? So let me just take us back one small step. So out of the text, Decolonizing Research Forum by the Caribbean, each of the authors were co-authors as well as co-participants in this study, myself included, and we utilize groundings for the most part as its methodological stance, right? And in doing that, these Caribbean researchers of multi-ethnicities and multi-states within the Caribbean were really coming to reason about how they came to know themselves as Caribbean researchers and what that meant, and really demystifying that. They had the full gamut and use to write in any language, any Creole, use artifacts throughout completely, do oral based photographs, you name it, that was there. And we came to a reasoning session about what we were hearing, thinking, working on, because keep in mind, they were also edified through co-authoring the book and the text and having their chapters in there. So what did it mean for them to have done that work in decolonizing research as in that presence? And they had to do some highly reflexive thinking in that process. So here comes the decolonizing methodologies and the process in which to undergo this, looking at your values, your axiology, and then your onto epistemologies, how you know what you know and you know it, right? And this process that Alexander and Ellis in 2004 talk about, imagine you have a mirror of yourself in front of it, and how do you see the self, seeing the self through and as the other? Let me repeat that one more time, because that's not easy unless you've really marinated it. How do you see yourself, seeing yourself through and as the other fully? So essentially, I was trying to get to that point, and coming out of all the beautiful, beautiful just talks and the reading, the music, was these three overarching processes that we dive into. So first one is developing this intersectional consciousness. The second one is using critical community-centered decolonizing frameworks and methodologies. The third one is unleashing our emancipatory imagination. I want to make a note that this is still ongoing, because now the process is to really spread it a little bit further, to be quite honest with you. And then as I'm going through it, I am rereading a lot of the Taino language in the process, and the Carib language, figuring out that process that was being unearthed in doing this type of work, and will rename a lot of these in that context. So the first one, developing intersectional consciousness, what you're seeing somewhat blurred out, forgive me, is one of the author's walls of inspiration in their room. And it's something that they refer to quite often. And they talk about the Kalinga bird, they talk about Walter Rodney, about the various ancestors and chains and how knowledge has been considered throughout the years. And so the authors negotiated their many, many responses of what it meant to be a Caribbean researcher, and this notion of the melting pot and the various indigenous groups, as well as ethnic groups that are throughout the Caribbean, that steers away from the monolith kind of understanding, but engaging in a plural understanding of their identity. Also understanding, for example, from some of the colleagues spoke about Afro-Caribbean feminism versus Indo-Caribbean feminism, and how Indo-Caribbean women in particular were upheld as sacred and edified in many ways, that Afro-Caribbean women were treated to be the enchained wombs of slavery and enslavement. So that was also spoken about, and quite powerful depictions, to be quite honest with you. And a lot of these came out through the texts that are on this wall, the various quote citations, and really unpacking these images close up took a process, but it was well worth it. And so that when we talk about the Caribbean, to talk about it in a monolithic way really completely eradicates the true essence of the Caribbean. It is such a diverse region. And how can we get to the various intersectional processes and pieces of consciousness to understand the core elements throughout the Caribbean and the uniqueness of their vulnerability in each state that is very, very different. As well as, so to drive to a more critically conscious point. So for others, which is worth noting, is that the identity actually created spaces of tension and statelessness. So those who were born in Guyana, for example, and then moved to Jamaica, and then not having that, having those kind of dichotomies of figuring out, well, who they are, whether Guyanese, whether it's Jamaican, and feelings of tension, of uncertainty and statelessness, or what it means to be Caribbean, not knowing which space that they land in, right? So there was those notions of talks as well that was going on. This second principle is using critical community-centered decolonizing frameworks and methodologies. And there are three prongs underneath this tenet overall. What you're seeing in the background, and thank goodness you guys are on Zoom because you can zoom in with your eyes, is one of the journal artifacts. So really was reasoning and had this particular co-author decided to have this diagrammatic representation. And towards the left bottom corner, the top part is all in Jamaican standardized Creole. And I say standardized, real Jamaican Creole. And she translates it as well, to be quite honest with you, but talk about you know, the language and building about education and how that work is being done by really pushing forth Jamaican Creole full on as a language and recognizing in this instance the Jamaican language unit. In the middle, right below, I love the quote that she has, which is writing our stories by us, for us, and for the world, rather than having the stories being written about us, right? So this was a depiction in terms of a whole different identity model of what it meant to be decolonized, decolonizing, and decolonization. And looking at it from a social justice lens, creating more indigenous forms of knowledge, where our tendency to adopt educational models and procedures that which take inadequate account of the unique aspects of the West Indian language and context, absolutely. So this was just a beautiful kind of one of the artifacts that had looked at in unpacking what a new form of decolonizing frameworks for us and by us would be. And all of these critical persons that are named here, Ruby King, Dennis Craig, Errol Miller, Velma Pollard, Hyacinth Evans, Josette Lewis, Michael, Beverly Bryan, are absolutely renowned Caribbean scholars that go undercited or uncited completely, especially when people are doing research about the Caribbean. The second prong underneath this tenet is embracing indigenous ways of knowing. And I'll just read out this excerpt that was spoken. Decolonizing research involves searching for and experimenting with appropriate methodologies that are culturally relevant and useful in the context that one is carrying out research. This is particularly relevant among the African descent populations that I've carried out research on in Brazil, South Africa, and to a lesser extent in Jamaica. This is because cultural practices and beliefs in the Black diasporic community are often passed down from generation to generation in oral form, such as storytelling, riddles, jokes, sayings. In addition, the theater tradition is strong in Jamaica, where entertainment for many young people begins in the church, in a setting where children are expected to perform for audiences. This means devising culturally appropriate methods that make use of these traditions and skills, thereby opening spaces in our largely Western informed epistemologies and methods to give center stage to the voice of the people we are trying to represent in our very own writing. And then the third prong underneath this tenet is empowering the local participants. And this is where one of our co-authors was really navigating the tensions of why to do this work. So maybe the focus needs to be moved from the researcher to the focus of the research, or maybe the essence of being a Caribbean researcher is not the identity of the researcher. Maybe it lies in the identities of the Caribbean peoples who are at the center of the research and the context which these are developed, experienced, and lived. Or perhaps this is the crux of being a Caribbean researcher. You can literally read the tug and war debate that is happening mentally for this co-author in understanding Caribbean identity and the purpose of doing this, of doing research as a Caribbean researcher, and the tug of war of doing that. And these are all persons in academia, so I'll say that as well. So the third principle of the methodology process is unleashing our emancipatory imagination for why we do this work. These designing decolonizing methods is to create opportunities for post-colonial colonized people to reframe, redefine, and rename one's current and future realities based on their individual and collective liberatory interests. When we witness, and you guys can Google it because social media is a real thing now, history in the making 48 hours ago by Barbados becoming a republic, that demand was literally 55 years, even more in the making. Because the reality is most of our countries, including my beloved Jamaica, is still a sovereign state. That means that we pay the taxes that uphold the Governor General's house in the King's house, okay? This house has many acres. It's a symbolism of inequities. It's a symbolism of the paradox between the apprenticeship era in the 1830s to 1840s after enslavement that continues to be justifiable by our nation state. And so what Barbados has shown us in our modern times is that the reality of us becoming truly independent is possible, but we must take some really bold steps because we will no longer be a part of the Commonwealth, right? Which, let's face it, we've never experienced Commonwealth, literally or figuratively. And so concluding thoughts. George Yancey wrote back in 2008 and completely applicable in 2021 and before and thereafter. His formidable article called Colonial Gazing, the production of the body as other. It describes the dynamics of colonialism as a means of socially producing reality shapes colonized bodies through powerful processes of inscription. Yancey argues that there's a violence aspect of colonialism that requires a way of thinking that defines all that is good, but only good in European terms, or in white terms. So moreover, not only did the colonizer impose this Eurocentric way of viewing the world to justify their oppressive actions, they also coerced the colonized to believe it, to adopt all things Eurocentric ways, right? What he refers to as white ideological discursive formations. Thus, if you follow Yancey's premise, anyone desiring to conduct research in a Caribbean context, myself included, has already been contaminated. And to engage in colonial gazing where we begin to betray our authentic selves. We begin to betray our authentic self and adopt colonial ways of viewing the world. So I will end by saying that the continued work is how do we resist against colonial ways of knowing? Because when education was first fit for the plantation economy that most of the Caribbean knows, it was to have a supply chain to reify the plantation itself. So I normally ask for and demand, in fact, that we resist from doing that. Yes, we continue colonial gazing constantly and we move to nowhere else. So that is all I have for you, lovely folks. I'm going to stop sharing so I can at least see the screen, and then we can open up for comments, dialogue, questions, teachable moments. from both of us to engage in some good discourse. So.
Okay, thank you. Oh my God, thank you. That was an amazing talk. And that personally touched me because I am from Guadeloupe. We still colonize, and with what's happening in Barbados, there are some talks of emancipation and not necessarily independence, because I don't think we are socially ready for that. But then there are some talk about that. But anyway, this was a really really interesting talk, and thank you a lot for that. So I have a few questions, but I don't want to monopolize the talk. So I will invite everyone to either raise your hand, your virtual hand, so that we can unmute you and you can ask your question directly. Or if you prefer, you can write your questions in the chat, and then we will be monitoring those. While we let people to, well, give them time to write down more or raise their hand and kind of absorb everything that was said. I guess if we can start with one question, is that you talk a lot about how your history and your own lived experience were really central to not only envision your research, but also how you conduct it, how you analyze it, and kind of how you report it back to the world. So I was kind of wondering how, like, when you talk about the way you communicate and then you report, like, how can you make sure that, you know, all the work that you've done with this analyzing, with this positionality thinking and all that kind of really emerge back when you report your research? Because most of the medium that we have are like publishable articles, right? So it's kind of rigid when you have such a large arrays of methods and methodologies that you can use. So how can you take that wide opportunities and then put it into that really limited journal article?
So Louise, if I'm understanding the question, you're asking how do you put your positionality within research articles for publication?
Not necessarily, more like how you take the various experience and the methodologies and the finding that you have that emerge from those decolonized methodologies. And then, but you still have to constrain them into the journal article form for it to be scientifically valid. So I was just wondering how you go from that to the journal without losing, you know, all the findings and the
right. And also the real ontoepistemologies, right, of it. So, you know, the real meaning of it, the real groundings of it, like, why are we doing this in the first place? There's two things. One is, when I chose to write this, I chose to write this in a book form. So what you guys didn't see, forgive me, is this part here. So let me just share this real quick. And the reason why is I get a little bit more latitude of doing that. So if you guys can see real quick, these are just some of the books that I have written or have chapters in. So the one that you guys heard from is this one in particular. It was actually just received 2 awards. One was in the pandemic. It was a 2020 Academic Outstanding Choice Award, Academic Outstanding Title from the American Library Association. And then it just received recognition from the Association for the Study of Higher Education in International Higher Education Research Award. And I named that because I agree with you. I don't think if I had put it first in a journal article, and it depends on a journal article, right? That it would have received I would have been free enough to write and demand how I wanted to write this work. So I purposefully chose the outlets and the home for this type of research first. Now, coming out of that, there are other studies that have spawned from it. And yes, I am selecting homes for it. More and more, there are quite a bit of journals that are doing the proper work of honoring decolonizing research and methodologies, and there are networks out there as well. So I'm a heavy citation politics believer, and of who I cite and for whom do I cite for. And so it does reflect in where I also publish my work now. I will say that that wasn't always the case though. So when I was a student, and oftentimes you are, you know, co-authoring with your professors or with other students, for example, you don't even, for me at the time, I didn't have that level of awareness. So even though my dissertation was focused on postcolonial theories, I wanted to get out in the market so badly. I didn't think about for whom and for why was I really doing this, and where was the equitable, you know, journals to do it. So I agree with you that in sometimes, especially in the beginning of my academic career, I published where I could publish, right? As I've become more senior and demanding more, and also just becoming more aware of the type of researcher I am, the political activist in me, I just don't cite in some journals anymore for nothing. Like, it don't matter to me because I don't conform to that. That's just the reality. But I will say that there is a technique for how to get your research out if you are committed to doing decolonizing methodologies and works in that nature. And that do not have to be confined to the so-called Western scientific rigor of it. And I want to say all of this because I was first trained as an econometrician doing econometrics and statistical research, okay? So, you know, being able to decipher rhetoric and bias is very important when you move towards this type of research area. And to also understand that there's a lot of rhetoric and bias even within formal quantitative forms of research, et cetera, and there's scientific journals. So I will say that it isn't the popular norm, so you're not speaking to the choir for sure, but there are avenues to do this work. So it all depends on where you are in the journey, what type of researcher you want to be, and what type of research you want to be known for. That's also very important as you guys come out of the graduate and come into the academy, that type of work, or move to the academy and what throughout the academy as well. So.
Okay, thank you. I mean, would you be able to share some of the maybe if you have like a recommendation of potential journal or like kind of that would more reflect the direction of research that we might want to go in.
Sure. I'll share some resources with you guys afterwards, definitely. Not a problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Is there, before I ask another question, is there any question from the audience? Please feel free to raise your hand or type your question. Oh, we have a question from Maria. Unmute you. Oops, can I unmute you? I think I can unmute you.
Did it work?
Yes.
I tried to unmute myself several times and it was like the host has to decide. So yes, thank you so much for organizing this, Louis, Madhu, and Sarah, and for coming to talk to us, Dr. Stewart. That was amazing. I'm a huge fan. I had the book, Decolonizing Qualitative Approaches since last January. So we had a countdown for this talk.
Thank you, Maria.
So I don't think you can see me, but I am a student here at Waterloo. I should say I was born and raised in Italy. I am white and I'm doing research in the Caribbean and specifically Antigua and Barbuda. And so obviously, I think as maybe some other people in this audience, now we're like freaking out and we're thinking, how are we going to do this? And how are we going to do this in a way that makes sense to the people where we're doing research, but also makes sense to us and we can be at peace with it later. Also with my positionality, I have to reconcile the fact you mentioned being a researcher who had training in econometrics and stats, and I have the same training. So I use a lot of those methods in my research. And I'm in my third year. I'm ready to go to the field. I have everything planned out and I use all these methods and methodologies. And now I'm like, well, have to figure out in the next 2 weeks how to make sense of this situation in a way that I ethically feel like it's good for me and for the people I'm doing research with. So this is a very broad question. You talked about a lot of really insightful elements, but if you were to, I don't want to say dumb it down, but make it practical for students for researchers at our stage, what would be a few things that you would suggest we did?
Yeah, that's a good one. So Maria, help me get some context. So you're doing your dissertation research, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it has to be individual. And the research that you're doing, does it involve persons, nature? What does it involve?
People and nature. So I work with a community of fishers. I have a partnership with the fisheries division in Antigua. And I work with 2 community researchers from Antigua.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So that's important. So there's a couple of things that normally help my students to navigate this space when they are coming in from outside of the communities to do research on external communities, right? One is similar to the work of phenomenology where you bracket in your bias. I typically have my students interview with me first. And that's a process with your supervisor that you could do to understand, which you probably have done in different ways, but this is more formal in that you are gonna be asked the questions that you're gonna ask the participants, right? So you can understand why are you asking these questions and from what vantage point. And then we work through the analysis of it to really code for how power and privilege is coming through in the space, as well as ways in which you can co-construct the space. The other thing that I then have students do is throughout their chapter 1 and their intro chapter conceptual framework, and then again in their methodology, they foreground their positionality, but more so as an accomplice and ally in the process. So they name those real tensions of the risk of doing this work from a very Eurocentric, weaponizing way, and how they are doing the work instead from an accomplice allyship way, okay? And a really good text for you to read on that is gonna be, this is a large book, but so you don't necessarily have to this is where I teach from, but it's readings for diversity and social justice. But in the back of it, kind of like, what's the point? Why do we do this? Is a great chapter by Barbara Love about developing liberatory consciousness. That's one, and I can send it to you, just the title so you have it. And then 2, which is much, much better, is a cycle of liberation. And it talks about the journey that you are on and where you are in that cycle in particular. So you can literally document that process and memo in that process to you, because the idea is, I'm glad that you said that you're working with a community of researchers. So how will they be acknowledged, prefaced, really partnered with in the process, right? How do you give back to the communities that you're taking from? how do you do that real cultural brokering needs to be really documented, named, right? Because even if your ethics review board didn't require it, you require it. So that's some of the things that we talk about, that intersectional consciousness, that's that development of self. But so you're document this very rich kind of process in doing this work as an outsider. The last thing I will say is any researcher is an outsider to poorer communities, okay? Myself included. When I did research in Jamaica, even though I was born and raised in Jamaica, because of the very nature of the elitism that goes with being a researcher, there are very few of us in the whole region, you are automatically an outsider. So I had to broker that insider-outsider role. So what I did was I taught classes, I substituted in classes because my research was in schools. Anytime I was gonna collect data, I spent extra time in the rooms by helping the teacher or helping the students. So I was not a passive direct observer. So when I was collecting even surveys, for example, I collected over 1,700 surveys throughout Jamaica. Some teachers needed me to just teach a lesson on surveys. Sure, let's do this. And that way, this became a real brokering rather than me just taking. After the research was done, which is even more important, is what you do with your study. And this, of course, goes back to sustainability, right? After the research was done, I launched a 6-year study in a couple of my schools that today, we're in March, right? My then 9th graders or grade 3rd form students are just graduating for the first time from the University of the West Indies. So a part of my study was looking at access and equity into post-secondary education. And I went back to the communities that I took research from to implement the very implications that they gave me and implement it on the very populations that I took the study from. So today I have a group of them. I have over 600 in the pipeline because of a sustainable project. But the first cohort I worked with that I studied on back in 2013 are just graduating from college now, University of West Indies. So I say all of this because there is an ethical responsibility post-dissertation to go back to the communities that you got your degree from. They are the reasons why you're getting your degree. So that shouldn't, so those are some real tangible way. It is very labor intensive. It is downright exhausting, and it is not required by any committee or ethics review board, but it should be required by you as an ethical researcher that wants to do more authentic decolonizing research. So that's one of the more like ground hands-on examples of what you can do.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So while we wait, I actually have a follow-up question to Maria's because we are in COVID-19. It doesn't seem like it's going to go better anytime soon. So, you know, a lot of the things that would require being in person, being with the community, interacting, being even like, you know, like, for example, I go through my surveys and talk to the people, but then at the same time I cannot necessarily stay long because maybe there's a pocket of infection. They are worried of me because like, who is this outsider coming? They might have COVID. So you know, like how? So I guess in COVID time, how can you maintain that same level of engagement, that same level of building these relationships when the disease doesn't really allow you to be close to people?
Right. So it takes twice as much work, Louine. That's the reality. COVID has taken twice as much in many different instances. In research is nothing short of it. So depending on what the type of research is, right? It will depend on how much interaction your type of research really calls for. That's the other thing that would be helpful. But for example, so my context is going to be education. So in the educational context, schools have not been open back since March 2020. Before I left, I have worked with the Ministry of Education in Jamaica, and then I work with the CARICOM, Caribbean Public Health Agency, as their social scientist. And in doing that work, really had to help solidify some of the platforms to help with the teachers using, at first it was Zoom, went from Zoom to Google Classroom. It was such a mess, to be quite honest with you. But one example is you find where the need most is, and then figure out in many ways how you have access to help with that need. So whatever the need is. So even though COVID is highly restrictive from person to person, there are other ways to make connections that can happen. The reason for most of Jamaica now being in so much high debt for lost learning is the lack of internet service, for example. So the other thing that we did was set up different we have parish libraries still in operation. Those were opened up to send back like hard copy documents for students to pick up in their central parish community libraries. So that's also an option, but it depends on where is the need greatest and how is your research serving that need, for example, and how you as a researcher or just as a citizen, let's just face it, can help with bridging some of those needs to close the gaps. And you have to just be mindful of the gaps that you yourself can close. You can't close the whole thing, but within what you can control, how you can lessen some of these gaps.
Okay, thank you.
And then just protect yourself, to be honest with you. I mean, that's the other option to keep protecting yourself and your community and just, following the guidelines, but also figuring out where the greatest needs are.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Is there, I'll just turn back to our audience. Is there any other questions? Sarah. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I'd also like the audience to have a chance, but I have another follow-up on Maria, if that's okay. So you mentioned how labor intensive that is, and your job is a busy one regardless, right? So, for early career researchers, for PhD students, for, people, yeah, I think especially in the early career, because as you mentioned as well, as you get further on, you have a little more leeway in terms of milestones and so on. So, how do we get around that? Or is it a matter of, not just the timing, but sometimes you don't have a supportive, maybe a committee member or something. These things don't always align with the structures of academia. And we're not, as you said, like incentivized, not required to do these kinds of things. Funding bodies don't maybe care so much. So is it a matter of like sort of a culture shift in academia, or kind of restructuring the whole? Yeah. What do you think?
You're asking all the right questions. It is labor intensive. Let me just tell you that, first of all. Academia is in general, let's just face it, right? I think I told you from the very nature of my literature review, of course I could have picked different topics, right? But my literature review, I would argue, could have probably been passable, right? But, when my supervisors told me, listen, you're not doing justice to any of these theories if you're not doing the due diligence, the real research work of doing research, getting your hands dirty, going into the field. Now, this is before I got IRB. This was a literature review, literature synthesis. They were adamant that you need to have the artifacts because you're finding stories of stories, right, that are centuries old. But what does it mean to you to do this work? And I'm glad that they pushed me and said that, because what I think it did was prepared me to do research in an authentic way. Now, I'll be honest as well, when I was a student, I was a hustler. I'm the alchemist of a hustler when it comes to this. One, I didn't have money as an immigrant student in the United States without no money, fully on scholarship fund, and I knew I had to end at a certain time. Every paper I wrote for my assignments that were essay-based became a part of a larger literature review for publication. And I quickly learned and just asked critical questions from older researchers. What you guys are doing right now is the right thing to do. This is that type of professional development and resources and stuff like that that you are garnering. I would absolutely look at my essays, my research papers I was writing for class, and seeing ways in which I could build on them for future research study to enter into publications. So I had a cadre of pubs coming out of just my doctorate, right? So I was writing my dissertation, but I was also mindful that I needed to be publishing research as well. And I've spent all this time in school for what? Not just, I was like, I already collected this whole kind of, portfolio of research papers that were graded by academics. So therefore there must be some good. And how could I then enhance them, update the literature, figure out if they're going to be a budding conceptual framework, etc. And so by the time I was leaving out of academia, I had some pubs in the pipeline. I had some pubs published, but I had publications in the pipeline. So it kept the strategy of this game that we play as early career researchers in play. So that when I was doing the work in the field now, this is when I had gotten IRB at the time and I was in Jamaica doing the work, everything I thought that was going to go right went through the door. That's how uneducated I was to do research in the Caribbean, okay? First of all, I had set up like Qualtrics survey. I don't know if you guys use Qualtrics, right? Right? Yeah. Okay. Try saying, hey, 194 principals of schools, here is a survey link. Can you get your students to do it? Okay. I was waiting 3 months later. They were like, who is this and why are you doing it? Even though I had all these protocols, these were all Western Eurocentric protocols. They had no governance in the country, none. I had to go door to door to all of my research sites because they're like, you want research from us? Then you're coming to us to get it. Now that's what research really is. Or perception about us just developing a survey online, sending a link and expecting that that link will be clicked in somewhere in Hanover or Westmoreland is my own colonial gazing. And it was furthest from the truth. So by going there, they put a face to the research. I gave up my time to also help in the classrooms. And that was more of me. I mean, it doubled my research time and timeline. Okay, I'm going to name that. I ran out of funding and resources, but I was in the country and my research was that much richer for it. I'll be honest with you. It was that much better, that much more authentic, and that much richer and accountable to what my purpose of the study was supposed to do, where I wasn't taking from these communities, but I was giving back. And I knew that I had to broker a trust before I was even allowed into the space, to be honest with you. And as brokering that trust, I gave up the only capital I had, which was my human capital. Sometimes the monetary capital as well. I had to buy lunches or something that occurred in the classroom or go back the next day or whatever it was. But my human capital had to come to front play. And there was a real bargaining going on between the research side and myself and what I would offer in terms of knowledge. And thankfully, it was taken in most spaces. And when those times occurred, I knew I had to get back to these spaces and places to give back all the implications, all the research findings I had gleaned. I knew that there were particular places that needed the implementation of the work. So when the work was done, I was able to go back. After I got hooded, graduated, the AME, I held true to where we talk about trustworthiness, where we talk about, real peer memoing and monitoring, peer reviewing. and really spoke to those participants about the work that would come in afterwards, after I had taken so much. I just felt like it was the best way for me to honor the process of doing the work by not rewarding, but by literally playing a role in the development of these very youth that I had taken research from. And I was able to do that literally. I graduated in 2013. I was at home in September, and I was working back with the schools. Wow. And I don't think that could have happened if I had taken a Western ideology of just take, because Western epistemology is largely just take. They don't give back. So we graduate based on taking. And we need to do a better job, myself as an academic and a researcher and a teacher, teaching my students, well, how do you give back to the populations that gave you that degree? It is not the institution that gave you the degree. It's the populations that you're researching that are giving you that degree, because without them, there would be no degree for you. So that's how I have navigated figuring out the type of research I want to do. That is going to make me, I think Maria said it well, I can wrestle with myself afterwards and feel good about what I did, to be honest with you. So yeah, but Sarah, you know, depending on where you are in the journey, this becomes a lot easier to talk about as you get through the journey. There are some parts of the journey that just makes this feel impossible. So I would say, depending on your research study, the magnitude and your capacity, you decide at what increments and timelines do you make that real kind of critical approaches to back to the community that did the work with you.
Thank you. And thanks for your honesty. It's good to know, like, eyes wide open what it entails. But you're talking about reversing the extractive process that it is, right? So it's a total mindset shift, I think.
Absolutely. And then we do it for these foreign institutions, right? That own our research afterwards. So how do we reclaim that? And how do we give it back to the communities that gave us back? It kind of is very intuitive, but it's hard work. And it's not required of us to do it.
Yeah.
So it requires each of us to really want to cultivate that mindset to get that work done. So
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. And I feel about the Qualitative survey.
Yes.
It doesn't work.
It was laughable at best, trust me.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, Maria, go ahead.
I just wanted to say something really quick, which is thank you for saying these things, because we are constantly bombarded with things that matter. Like, I just attended a bibliometrics, how to improve your metrics workshop on Tuesday, and we hear that stuff constantly, and we have this constant anxiety of like trying to fit into a box within our 4 years so that academia can think that our research is good. But after hearing this talk, I think all of us are reminded of what really counts and what is really important and why we're actually doing this. So there are things that matter more than bibliometrics. So thank you.
100%, so much more. And when you're in the field, in the country, it will click to you in ways that this is still a little bit foreign, but feels good. But when you're there and you see the communities that you're working with and you're like, yo, thank you for my degree. I am humbled by your level of critical expertise. And I'm talking the fishermen with probably a grade 2 education or a grade 11 education, right? I need to thank you. And how do I best do that? And that will be individual to each of you doing your research. But it is such a process that we are not rewarded for, that I think, to be honest, decolonizing research, indigenous forms of research are trying to push the envelope on, but not everybody, not everybody believes in that. That's the truth. So I'm happy that you guys are doing this work, to be honest. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. I'm just gonna be cognizant of the time, and so that we don't monopolize you too much. If there are no other questions or comments, I will say again, thank you a lot. I was personally looking forward to this talk. I was super excited. It was really, really informative, really good food for thought, even how we go forward, depending on the stage of the research that we are in. Yeah, like, I don't know, it's yeah, I'm super happy anyway. So so before we wrap up, I just want to give a bit of a like way forward. So this was our last session for the year. We will be having one final session in the whole talk in February 22nd, 2022, with Professor Linda Chuhiwai Smith. She actually accepted. Yeah, so we're super happy. She will be.
I actually heard Linda in Australia. She's phenomenal. You guys are going to be blown away out the water. Linda is wicked, 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 wicked. So.
Oh, nice. So yeah, so she will be with us online in February. So we will give more information later on. And also, so building on the experience that we've been having from the beginning of the course of this initiative. So we are building an e-course. So where we will basically put together all the talks will be there, and all the kind of the questions and how. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not making a good explanation right there, but we'll provide more information later on. We'll be launching it potentially by mid-winter 2022. But we will provide more information about like the content, registration, etc. at a later date. So that's it for today. Thank you again, Professor Stewart, for coming and for giving us this amazing talk, and thank you for everyone to come and attend. And so I wish you, well, we're in December, so happy holidays if you take any vacation, and we'll see you next year. So thank you. Thank you.
And Loreen, I had just put my email in there in case you guys want to write me and get support outside. I know sometimes it can be very difficult, so I'm happy to help support you guys' work. So
thank you. We will actually be sharing the recording and then any resource that you will share with us, and your contact information as well in an email. Fantastic. To everyone. So yes, thank you.
Thanks for having me. Take care, guys.
Thank you.